学经管系老师尤雅文老师，他会针对行销部分帮我们做一个是只有适用在所谓的盈利大部分。其实，在非盈利的部分或教育的部分的话，其实或是在多多少少行销的概念。那我觉得对于我们而言的话，日前教或是你未来可能对人力资源发展是有兴趣的同学的部分，还是应该多多少少了解一下行销的一些基本概念。所以我就请刘老师的部分来简单的介绍一下。那我们是不是以热烈的掌声欢迎一下刘老师？
各位同学，大家好。
好。
你们好。那你们都吃饱了吗？都吃过了哈。好，那今天很开心哦。没关系，我这样就可以了。好。今天很开心哦，来到你们的学校，真的是很漂亮的地方哦。我不知道说同学有没有去过亚洲大学？其实有时候。尤其是在每年的5、6月的时候，其实也可以找时间去亚洲大学看看，真的也是很美丽哦。因为刚好是我们亚洲大学的花季，在这边先推销一下我们亚洲大学，毕竟是行销嘛，哈。
有啊，他们最近不是有一个那个安藤忠雄的
对，
馆，
刚开幕，
很值得去，
真的很漂亮，是艺术品，
对，艺术品，
真的是艺术品，花了非常多的钱。好，首先。我现在问一下同学，你认为行销是什么呢？有谁可以告诉我吗？什么是行销？在你的认知里面，你认为行销是什么？是什么呢？
经过包装的推销。
经过包装的推销，不错。还有吗？
行销是无所不在的，就是除了产品以外，还有整个产品的特色。还有它的无形的、有形的价值都一起销售这样子。不是只有单一的行为，因为行销不是只有卖的这种名字，它还有后续一些服务的动作。要整体。好，
非常好。好，那我们来看一下，行销是创造沟通，还有传递价值给顾客那还有经营顾客的关系那一连串的让你的顾客知道你的产品到底是什么。记得去把这个商品给它销售出去。那当然，我们现在的行销跟以前的行销其实是已经不大一样了那我们可以透过选择你的目标市场透过创造、传授还有这个沟通让你知道说有这样的产品提供给我们的顾客记得他们看到你之后，然后愿意去购买你的这个商品所以它会涉及到2个单位那就是双方认为说这样的产品是有价值的，他才愿意去做购买嘛好，那我们来看一下行销的起源与核心为什么要付学费？其实就是要换取教育嘛，对不对？那买电影票是要换什么？换取娱乐啊，不是说单纯只是想要买电影票一样，你希望说可以坐在一个空间里面，然后好好的去做一个享受所以这也是一种算是一种交换的那种动作。那买人寿保险呢，目的是为了什么呢？是为了要换取保障。那你从这边看来，就可以知道说，其实就是也是一个很简单的一个交换动作。好，那我们从这个市场理念的演进来看，这个4种市场的理念，从最早期的这个生产观念，再来这个销售观念、行销观念，然后到最后目前的这个全方位的这个行销的这个观念那首先最早期的，在我们阿公阿嬷的时代只要把东西给生产出来，就可以卖得出去。什么东西？反正那时候是什么？供少于就是供给是比较少的嘛，对不对？那只要是你生产任何的东西，市场上没有这样的东西啊，那很多人觉得这样的东西他们可以用得到啊，所以只要是生产出来的东西，都可以卖得出去。所以他忽略这个环境的变化，还有不管说现在目前环境怎么样，当然还有忽略消费者的需求，不会说像我们现在买衣服，可能还要注意一下你的这个颜色啊、尺寸啊、大小啊，反正他认为说只要是生产出来，就一定会有人买，那就把这个现象称为什么？行销既视症，所以他完全都不管，消费者他们在想什么，他认为说，反正生产出来就一定会有人去做购买， 那行销性是这个例子，以为咖啡只要什么香浓好喝就一定卖得掉，但是其实是这样子吗？并不是哦。好，你知道卖咖啡它可以怎样？凸显生活品味，跟人分享快乐，还可以放松心情。在这里我就问一下大家，你们认为说，Starbucks 它在卖什么呢？它在卖 feel， 是吗？你为什么愿意花一杯100多块，甚至200多块的钱？为什么不要在那个85度 C？ 我买一杯咖啡35块钱就好了。这两者的差异到底在哪里？差很大嘛，就是一种 feel 的感觉嘛，对不对？一进去那个Starbucks让感觉哇，整个气质都起来了，都感觉自己都不太一样了，走路都觉得很有风，觉得自己就是一个淑女啊，一个绅士那种感觉。坐在那个咖啡厅里面啊，前面是一个这个玻璃然后这样照你觉得就是哇，还有 spotlight 照着你，就觉得哇，你自己非常的很有那种绅士还有淑女的风范。好，所以这个咖啡不仅仅只是在卖咖啡而已你有想说其实在卖咖啡之外还有什么附加的价值？你可以凸显你的品味啊，还有 Starbucks 还卖什么？除了卖 feel 以外，还有卖什么？气氛，是不是？这都是加在你的100-200块的这个咖啡的价钱里面的还有卖的那种这个感觉还有这个环境所以下次你们去 Starbucks 喝咖啡的时候，要好好的去感受一下，你的200块到底花在哪里？真的，为什么你愿意花那个钱？这样子你就可以感受到说，以后你真的要开一间咖啡厅的话，你要卖的是什么不是只有卖咖啡不好意思，消费者要的不是只有那样子而已，他们要的是 feel 还有品味，还有一种环境所以价总起来也才是有200块那个价值这个你们自己好好去感受，35块钱跟这200块钱的差异差非常的大好，那手机呢？是只要通话品质良好而已吗？是吗？你们现在同学应该很多人都有拿那个什么智慧型手机吧？是吧？那为什么你要去花1万多块钱、2万多块去买一台这个智慧型手机？为什么呢？全部都要炫耀没有人要炫耀嘛？这个非常重要，没错，对啊。手机不是只有拿来打电话而已它有很多的这个因素愿意让这个消费者愿意去花更多的钱，1-2万块钱去买一台这个手机它可以什么象征身份，对不对？为什么要花1-2万？这个身份感觉不一样可以跟朋友做分享可以玩这个download很多软体玩 APP 治愈人跟朋友做分享现在很多同学应该都会透过这个 LINE 跟自己的朋友去做这个沟通聊天还可以记录心情可以拍照现在多少人已经都没有在用相机了很多人都是干脆所有的功能集于一身透过这个手机就可以做很多事情了包括联络朋友包括就是拍照或者是上网什么的所以生产手机的话不是说只有通话品质良好就可以了还有一些其他的因素也是要去做这个考量到的如果没有考量到的话就有可能说怎样错失市场的机会啦，是不是？好，那再来发展到这个第2个阶段，销售观念他认为说其实只要把东西卖出去就好了就是有那种就是 他们怎么思考的呢？他认为说，反正卖得出去，他也不管说，到底这东西好还是不好，反正只要是认为说消费者有这个需求，他们就把它做出来，然后卖出去哦。好，销售的那个观念，认为说，东西卖出去，就不干我们的事情了，好，那东西永远归你的。那行销的观念呢，是怎么样？它是以顾客需求为优先，去满足这个顾客的需求，所以他会去考量到说什么？目标市场，市场的需求，整合4P 的部分，去满足客户来获利哦。目标市场怎么说呢？比如说今天家里面爸爸妈妈年纪比较大了嘛，眼睛不好，耳朵可能有时候还要叫2次，爸爸妈妈年纪比较大的大概70、80岁的爸爸妈妈，可能他们要的东西可能会不太一样哦。例如说像以手机来说的话，70、80岁的这个爸爸妈妈或爷爷奶奶，他们觉得说，手机的话，我只要可以打就好了。那在你生产手机的时候呢，可能就会依这样子的这个消费者去做这个手机它的功能的改变嘛。例如说它的铃声比较大声，或是说它的这个按键比较大，或者说它有什么求救的这个功能，之类的，去把这个手机生产出来，去满足这一个部分的这个消费者的需求。所以在行销观念这个阶段呢，他会先去考量到说，这个消费者他们的需求到底是什么。好，那到目前这个阶段，全方位行销观念，它是以更全面的观念来经营市场，所以它是透过什么？关系行销、内部行销、整合行销、社会行销，综合以上的方式，去做行销所以它会怎样？注重顾客的需求。那跟上下游的这个厂商也打好关系，尽量把价格就是压低。内部行销呢，随时跟这个就是全体员工保持这个良好的关系。因为其实为什么这个内部的员工非常重要？其实他们一言一行都会影响到什么？企业他们的形象。所以这部分也要做得很好啊。这样子的话，你的这个员工他们才会感受到说，其实企业主他们其实非常的用心，他们也愿意把他们的真心给他们的消费者，给他们的这个就是他们推销的这个消费者。那还有透过这个整合行销，它会整合这个产品服务、价格推广，等等，还有到最后这个社会行销。什么是社会行销？像我们现在很多的产品，最近这个食安事件实在让人觉得你在讲啥，对不对？我觉得到底这些厂商的这个道德到底在哪里，不太清楚那如果说比较注重那种社会行销或是公益行销的这种公司他们可能就会注意说，平常可能要做一些功德吧，对不对？把一些钱可能捐给一些这个社福团体或者说一些什么孤儿院或者什么老人院之类的，或是说他们使用的这个食品，可能是比较不会污染到环境之类的。好，那全方位行销的观念是怎样？他是认为说，生意不是只有做一次就说你的这个品质商品的品质或是服务一定要维持得很好，跟顾客保持良好的关系跟互动。就算说他们在购买你的商品之后呢，你还是要一直维持跟顾客的良好关系。像这部分的话，我觉得信用卡他们就做得非常的好。我每次接到这个信用卡账单的时候，我就觉得哇，怎么除了那个上面的这个我每个月需要付的这个钱之外，它还有很多的什么抵押会寄给你，要再去买一些其他的东西然后3不5时还要打电话给你说， 我们现在有什么这个保险啊，是不是要请你就是要考虑一下这样子啊？所以他们对这部分的人是真的是非常在行的哦，跟这个顾客保持良好的这个关系，好，那也要跟这个伙伴，就是你的供应商啊、通路商啊、广告代理商、物流业者等等，维持良好的关系。你跟他们维持良好的关系，这样大家才可以都赚到钱嘛，是不是？好，例如说，我们都知道现在是什么，通路非常的重要。你看 7-Eleven， 通路重不重要？你光是有他们一个这样的通路的话，你东西要卖就不是问题了嘛。那如果你今天没有这个通路的话，哇，糟糕了，要卖给谁呢？是不是？如果他有不愿意卖你的东西，或者说可能上架费比较高的时候，那你的那个就是你的power到底在哪里呢？是不是？例如说像7-Eleven，你们看得到光学相关的产品吗？是看不到的。那他就不卖他的东西啊，因为他们有自己的这个已经有自己的这个乳品了。在光学，例如说光学牛乳化，只有在哪里可以看得到 ？OK 啊，莱尔富啊，全家应该也有都在卖，但是 7-Eleven 绝对是没有的所以通路也非常的这个重要。所以要维持这个良好的关系不仅仅只有在顾客而已包括你上游的厂商也非常的重要。那再来这边，那大家看个照片好了，免得你们大家睡着了，这样子老师一直在看着字在那边讲话。我们来张照片，来，这张照片是美国一个旅馆。你看这个旅馆的话呢，觉得有跟其他的旅馆有什么不一样的地方？
舒很家的感觉，
舒很多，有家里的感觉。是不是？就觉得到这个旅馆就是有那种回到家的感觉，跟其他地方，其他地方的旅馆不大一样。那在这边的话，我先跟各位先分享一个影片好了。
Simple truth in leadership in the 21st century. In the 21st century, we need to actually look at, and what I'm going to actually encourage you to consider today, is to go back to our school days when we learned how to count. I actually think it's time for us to think about what we count. Because what we actually count truly counts. Let me start by telling you a little story. This is Van Quash. She came to this country in 1986 from Vietnam. She changed her name to Vivian because she wanted to fit in here in America. Her first job was in an inner city motel in San Francisco as a maid. I actually happened to buy that motel about 3 months after Vivian started working there. So Vivian and I have actually been working together for 23 years. With the youthful idealism of a 26-year-old, in 1987, I started my company and I called it Joie de Vivre, a very impractical name. And because I actually was looking to create the joy of life. And this first hotel that I bought, motel, was a pay-by-the-hour, no-tell motel in the inner city of San Francisco. As I spent time with Vivian, I saw that she had sort of a joie de vivre in how she did her work. It made me question and curious, how could someone actually find joy in actually cleaning toilets for a living? So I spent time with Vivian, and I saw that she didn't find joy in cleaning toilets. Her job, her goal, and her calling was not to become the world's greatest toilet scrubber. What counts for Vivian was the emotional connection she created with her fellow employees and our guests. And what gave her inspiration and meaning was the fact that actually she was taking care of people who were far away from home because Vivian knew what it was like to be far away from home. That very human lesson, more than 20 years ago, served me well during the last economic downturn we had. In the wake of the dot-com crash and 9/11, San Francisco Bay Area hotels went through the largest percentage revenue drop in the history of American hotels. We were the largest operator of hotels in the Bay Area, so we were particularly vulnerable. But also, back then, remember, we stopped eating French fries in this country. Well, not exactly, of course not. We actually started eating freedom fries. And we actually started boycotting anything that was French. Well, my name of my company, Joie de Vivre. So I started getting these letters from places like Alabama and Orange County saying to me that they were going to boycott my company because they thought we were a French company. And I'd write them back and I'd say, wait a minute, we're not French. We're an American company. We're based in San Francisco. And I'd get a church response, oh, that's worse. So one particular day, when I was feeling a little depressed and not a lot of joie de vivre, I ended up in the local bookstore around the corner from our offices. And I initially ended up in the business section of the bookstore looking for a business solution. But given my befuddled state of mind, I ended up in the self-help section very quickly. And that's where I got reacquainted with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I took one psychology class in college, and I learned about this guy, Abraham Maslow, as many of us are familiar with his hierarchy of needs. But as I sat there for 4 hours, full afternoon, reading Maslow, I actually recognized something that is true of most leaders. And one of the simplest facts in business is something that we often neglect, and that is that we're all human. Each of us, no matter what our role is in business, actually has some hierarchy of needs in the workplace. So as I started reading more Maslow, what I actually started to realize is that actually Maslow, later in his life, wanted to take this hierarchy for the individual and apply it to the collective, the organizations, and specifically the business. But unfortunately, he died prematurely in 1970. And so I wasn't really able to live that dream completely. So I realized in that dot-com crash that my role in life was to channel Abe Maslow. And that's what I did a few years ago when I actually took that 5-level hierarchy of needs pyramid and turned it into what I call the transformation pyramid, which is survival, success, and transformation. It's not just fundamental in business, it's fundamental in life. And we started actually asking ourselves the questions about how we were actually addressing the higher needs, these transformational needs, for our key employees in the company. These 3 levels of the hierarchy needs actually relate to the 5 levels of Maslow's hierarchy needs. But as we started asking ourselves about how we were addressing the higher needs of our employees and our customers, I realized we had no metrics. We had nothing that actually could tell us whether we were actually getting it right. So we actually started asking ourselves what kind of less obvious metrics could we use to actually evaluate our employees' sense of meaning or our customers' sense of emotional connection with us. For example, we actually started asking our employees, do they understand the mission of our company? And do they feel like they believe in it? Can they actually influence it? And do they feel that their work actually has an impact on it? We started asking our customers, did they feel an emotional connection with us? In one of 7 different kinds of ways. Miraculously, as we asked these questions and started getting attention higher up the pyramid, what we found is we created more loyalty. Our customer loyalty skyrocketed, our employee turnover dropped to 1/3 of the industry average. And during that 5-year dot-com bust, we tripled in size. And as I went out and started spending time with other leaders out there and asking them how they were getting through that time, what they told me over and over again was that they just manage what they can measure. And what we can measure is that tangible stuff at the bottom of the pyramid. They didn't actually even see the intangible stuff higher up the pyramid. So I started asking myself the question, how can we get leaders to start valuing the intangible? If we're taught as leaders to just manage what we can measure, and all we can measure is the tangible in life, we're missing a whole lot of things at the top of the pyramid. So I actually went out and studied a bunch of things, and I found a survey that showed that 94% of business leaders worldwide believe that the intangibles are important in their business. Things like intellectual property, their corporate culture, their brand loyalty, and yet only 5% of those same leaders actually had a means of measuring the intangibles in their business. So as leaders, we understand that intangibles are important, but we don't have a clue actually how to measure them. So here's another Einstein quote. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. I hate to argue with Einstein, but if that which is most valuable in our life and our business actually can't be counted or valued, are we going to spend our lives just mired in measuring the mundane? It was that sort of heady question about what counts that led me to take my CEO hat off for a week and fly off to the Himalayan peaks. Fly off to a place that's been shrouded in mystery for centuries, a place some folks call Shangri-La, that's actually moved from the survival base of the pyramid to becoming a transformational role model for the world. I went to Bhutan. The teenage king of Bhutan was also a curious man, but this was back in 1972, when he ascended to the throne 2 days after his father passed away. At age 17, he started asking the kind of questions that you'd expect of someone with a beginner's mind. On a trip through India, early in his reign as king, he actually was asked by an Indian journalist about the Bhutanese GDP, the size of the Bhutanese GDP. And the king responded in a fashion that actually has transformed us 4 decades later. He said the following. He said, why are we so obsessed and focused with gross domestic product? Why don't we care more about gross national happiness? Now, in essence, the king is asking us to consider an alternative definition of success. What is come to be known as GNH, or gross national happiness. Most world leaders didn't take notice, and those that did thought this was just a But the king was serious, and this was a notable moment. This was the first time a world leader in almost 200 years had suggested that intangible of happiness. Again, that leader 200 years ago, Thomas Jefferson, with the Declaration of Independence. 200 years later, this king was suggesting that intangible happiness is something we should measure and something that we should actually value as government officials. For the next 3 decades, next three dozen years, as king, this king actually started measuring and managing around happiness in Bhutan, and including just recently taking this country from being an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy with no bloodshed, no coup. And Bhutan, for those who don't know it, is the newest democracy in the world just 2 years ago. So as I spent time with leaders in the GNH movement, I got to actually really understand what they're doing, and I got to spend some time with the Prime Minister. Over dinner, I asked him an impertinent question. I asked him, how can you create and measure something which evaporates? In other words, happiness. And he's a very wise man, and he said, listen, Bhutan's goal is not to create happiness. We create the conditions for happiness to occur. In other words, we create a habitat of happiness. Ah, that's interesting. And he said that they have a science behind that art. And they've actually created 4 essential pillars, 9 key indicators, and 72 different metrics that actually help them to actually measure their GNH. In fact, one of those key indicators is, how do the Bhutanese feel about how they spend their time each day? That's a good question. How do you feel about how you spend your time each day? Time is one of the scarcest resources in the modern world, and yet, of course, that little intangible piece of data doesn't factor into our GDP calculations. So as I spent my week up in the Himalayas, actually I started to imagine what I call an emotional equation. And it focuses on something I read long ago from a guy named Rabbi Hyman Shachtel. How many know him? Anybody? 1954, he wrote a book called The Real Enjoyment of Living. And he suggested that happiness is not about having what you want. Instead, it's about wanting what you have. Or in other words, I think the Bhutanese believe happiness equals wanting what you have, imagine gratitude, divided by having what you want, gratification. The Bhutanese aren't on some aspirational treadmill, constantly focused on what they don't have. Their religion, their isolation, their deep respect for their culture, and now the principles of their GNH movement, all have actually fostered a sense of gratitude about what they do have. How many of us here as testers in the audience spend more of our time in the bottom half of this equation, in the denominator? We are a bottom-heavy culture in more ways than one. The reality is, in Western countries, quite often we do focus on the pursuit of happiness, as if happiness is something that we have to go out, an object we're supposed to get, or maybe many objects. Actually, in fact, if you look in the dictionary, many dictionaries define pursuit as to chase with hostility. Do we pursue happiness with hostility? Good question. But back to Bhutan. Bhutan's actually bordered on its north and south by 38% of the world's population. Could this little country, like a startup in a mature industry, be the spark plug that actually influences a 21st century of middle class in China and India. Wutong's actually created the ultimate export, a new global currency of well-being. And there are 40 countries around the world today that are actually studying their own G&H. You may have heard this last fall, Nicolas Sarkozy in France announcing the results of an 18-month study by 2 Nobel economists focusing on happiness and wellness effects. Sarkozy suggested that world leaders should stop myopically focusing on GDP and consider a new index, what some French are calling a joie de vivre index. I like it. Co-branding opportunities. And just 3 days ago here at TED, we actually had a simulcast of David Cameron, potentially the next Prime Minister of the UK, actually quoting one of my favorite speeches of all time, Robert Kennedy's poetic speech from 1968, when he suggested that we're myopically focused on the wrong thing and that GDP is a misplaced metric. So it suggests that the momentum is shifting. I've taken that Robert Kennedy quote and actually turned it into a new balance sheet in just a moment here. This is actually a collection of things that Robert Kennedy said in that quote. GDP counts everything from air pollution to the destruction of our redwoods. But it actually doesn't count the health of our children or the integrity of our public officials. As you look at these 2 columns here, doesn't it make you feel like it's time for us to actually start figuring out a new way to count? A new way to actually imagine what's important to us in life? Certainly Robert Kennedy suggested at the end of the speech exactly that. He said GDP measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile. Wow. So how do we do that? Well, let me say one thing we can just start doing 10 years from now, at least in this country. Why in the heck in America are we doing a census? In 2000, we're spending $10 billion in a census. We're asking 10 simple questions. It is simplicity. But all of those questions are tangible. They're about demographics. They're about where you live, how many people you live with, and whether you own your home or not. That's about it. We're not asking meaningful metrics. We're not asking important questions. We're not asking anything that's intangible. Abe Maslow said long ago something you've heard before, but you didn't realize it was him. He said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. We've been fooled by our tool. Excuse that expression. We've been fooled by our tool. GDP has been our hammer, and our nail has been a 19th and 20th century industrial era model of success. And yet 64% of the world's GDP today is in that intangible industry we call service, the service industry, the industry under it. And only 36% is in the tangible industries of manufacturing and agriculture. So maybe it's time that we get a bigger toolbox, right? Maybe it's time we actually get a toolbox that doesn't just count what's easily counted, tangible in life, but actually counts what we most value, the things that are intangible. I guess I'm sort of a curious CEO. I was also a curious economics major as an undergrad, and I learned that economists measure everything in tangible units of production and consumption, as if each of those tangible units is exactly the same. They aren't the same. In fact, as leaders, what we need to learn is that we can actually influence the quality of that unit of production by actually creating the conditions for our employees to live their calling. And in fact, in Vivian's case, her unit of production isn't the tangible hours she works, it's the intangible difference she makes during that 1 hour of work. This is Dave Erringdale, who's actually been a longtime guest at Vivian's Motel. He stayed there 100 times in the last 20 years. And he's loyal to the property because of the relationship that Vivian and her fellow employees have created with him. They've created a habitat of happiness for Dave. And he tells me that he can always count on Vivian and his staff there to make him feel at home. Why is it that business leaders and investors quite often don't see the connection between creating the intangible of employee happiness with creating the tangible of financial profits in the business? We don't have to choose between inspired employees and sizable profits. We can have both. And in fact, inspired employees quite often help make sizable profits, right? So what the world needs now, in my opinion, is business leaders and political leaders who know what to count. You count numbers, we count on people. What really counts is when we actually use our numbers to truly take into account our people. I learned that from a maid in a motel in a Canada country. What can you start counting today? What one thing can you start counting today that actually would be meaningful in your life, whether it's your work life or your business life? Thank you very much.
好 ，OK， 好，那我就问一下大家啊，看完这个影片之后呢，有什么感觉？有没有发展出另外一种市场的理念呢？从我们的这个生产观念、销售观念、行销观念，好到全方位行销观念。有没有发展出新的观念出来？有吗？有吗？都没有，还没。好，在我个人认为啊，我觉得其实行销下一步要做的是什么？可以创造，没错，嘿。创造需求而已吗？
觉得他举那个例子，那个越南员工的例子，好像比较强调关系行销的那种顾客关系的。
顾客关系的部分。
对啊，感觉上好像是。
还有吗？它里面有提到一个非常重要的部分，就是你要去创造出一个可以产生让人家觉得幸福的感觉。那在我个人认为，在下一步的这个行销，你可能就要去尝试着对你的员工、对你的上下游厂商，或是对你的消费者，尽量帮他们创造出可以让人家产生幸福的这种感觉，或是创造出一个可以让人家觉得就是一个幸福的这个环境。例如说像 7-Eleven，最早期 7-Eleven， 可能就只是认为说，他卖的是什么？方便，他卖的是便利嘛，24小时啊。但是现在呢，真的是这样子而已吗？他卖的是什么？安心你有没有觉得24小时哇，只要有一盏灯开在那边，就觉得看到它就觉得自己 safe 了，有没有？就无论多晚都有人陪着你，有没有？有吧？
有。
觉得很幸福吗？那种有这种感觉吗？有一点出来哈。那他现在卖的是什么呢？他有创造惊奇的感觉，有吗？3不5时就有一个什么公仔啊，你可以去集啊。好，那个我集到一个，刚好又收到你要的，哇，好开心啊，对不对？就觉得哇，自己又达成另外一个目标，人生的目标迈进了另外一大步了，有没有？我就因为最近又挤到别人没有的东西，他就创造那种很幸福的那种感觉出来，有吧？这样比较慢慢可以了解了哈。所以他不是说只有卖东西而已哦。如果你认为说 7-Eleven 他们只是在卖你要东西，那你就错了。他们非常的努力耶，努力去创造你的幸福感。所以你看，光是一个小小的这个便利商店，可以为我们做，就是带来那么大的这个启发好，所以现在不是说只有刚刚那几个观念而已可能要发展出下一步让人家觉得不一样的这种行销的这种观念。好。那再来的话，我就再跟大家大概就是在讨论一下这个行销环境的部分。为什么我们要了解这个行销的环境呢？那行销环境的这个重要性到底是什么？那我今天大概就是以这个文化跟经济这个部分来做这个讨论。 经济环境。在这里先讲一下我自己个人的背景好了。我在这个大学跟研究所的时候，还有高中时期我都是在这个南非求学。所以就是有一些小的故事啊，也可以跟你们做一些分享。等一下会一一跟大家做分享。那为什么行销要去了解这个经济环境的部分？原因到底在哪里呢？也非常重要啊，因为如果你没有了解说，当地他们的这个经济环境的话，生意可能不是你想象中的这样子这么简单哦。好，那经济制度的话，它大概就把它分为3种制度哦。这应该大家都非常知道，资本、社会还有混合型的这个制度哦。那也要去了解说，当地它的这个经济发展的这个程度，人均所得多少啊？他每个月家庭支出是多少啊？做行销的人必须要去了解说，这个家庭他愿意付多少的钱？他每个月开销多少？愿意花多少钱？你才有办法说，去找到你的这个目标客群嘛。针对他们，然后去做这个行销哦。所以先了解说，他到底是属于哪一种所得这个国家，很重要。好，那所得跟购买力，它平均这个所得分配多少啊？消费形态啊，的部分也很重要。为什么？每个国家他们的消费形态不一样，连这个人种的这个消费形态都不太一样哦。例如说像我之前本身在南非的时候呢，我就观察到说，这个黑人啊跟这个白人他们那种消费形态真的南辕北辙，差非常多。黑人的话呢，他们真的是不用月光他可能是每个月的这个15号可能就光光了，不是月光。那之后他下来怎么生存？可能就是来跟他的兄弟姐妹啊，就是大家互相帮忙一下，这样子过日子哦。好，那跟白人的消费形态是怎么样呢？他们可能是靠什么信用卡去做这个消费，就完全不一样，然后身上也完全都不带这个现金的，所以这部分你们需要去了解他们到底是怎么样去支配他们这个所得哦。那人口总量跟分布，你要当地有多少人，可以去购买你的商品呢？它人口分配，到底是这个男性多还是女性多呢？例如说这个据我所知，好像巴拉圭还是哪一个国家就是这个中南美洲那边，有一个国家应该是巴西或是巴拉圭他们女性就占比非常的高所以如果你在做这个行销的部分的话，是不是应该朝这个女性为主呢？可能你的这个胜算会比较大。那人口成长，人口年龄分配，为什么也很重要？如果说像日本啊，它是比较偏向这个老年的这个人口比较居多的话，是不是应该要发展相关的产品给这些人，让他们去做这个购买呢？可能这样的话，可能比较有机会。好，还有家庭平均人口数，那这部分为什么也要去参考？例如说像我们现在一般的家庭，大概就是家里面可能就是1、2个小孩，很少人现在会生，像我们爸爸妈妈那个年纪生7、8个、10个都有的。那所以你在做这个产品的包装的时候，是不是就要考虑到说，那我是不是应该要把你的这个量，大概就是包装在大概一家人大概3、4口人的这个包装，而不是说这样10口人的那种包装，他们可能3、4口人的人就不愿意去买10口人的这个量的这个商品了因为他们吃不完，是不是？基础设施，我们台湾很多这个非常厉害的那种业务厂商他们都就是愿意这样子拎着这个包包就是去外面做生意的在这部分的话，也要非常的了解外国这个环境为什么？运输设施不是每个国家都像台湾这样这么方便台湾真的是一个很方便的国家这个运输的部分在这里跟大家分享一下 我有个朋友，他们之前其实在南非的时候被外派到那个奈及瑞那个 Nigeria 好奈及利亚，然后呢怎么样？他跟我讲说，他们每次只要是出门的时候，他们必须要带2个保镖，然后保镖呢还必须带那个无支枪。然后我3不5时车子就突然停下来，为什么？为什么？你们可以猜得到吗？
动物走过。
太善良了，并不是哦，被拦下来干嘛？保护费、过路费啊。这你可以想象吗？在台湾是绝对不可能发生的，但是在国外真的是非常有可能，就被拦下来，设路障啊，你要过这里 OK 的，没问题啊。这个买路财哦，要记得给了，是不是？好，那所以要知道说，国外的这个环境，这部分运输的部分好，那通讯设施，这也要说到，台湾真的是非常方便。我有个朋友就来了，他在几年前，大概也没有多久以前大概5、6年前，我在南非要申请一个那个网路线，不是那种拨接的他只是要申请一个 ADSL 的那个线路而已你猜他花多少时间，那个线才拉到他们家的？你们觉得呢？
半年吧。
1个月，半年还多。
他跟我说，1年那个线才拉到他们家。那我就要问了，那你如果在那边做生意的，你怎么办？你每天就只能拨接吗？那拨接的费用是非常的高的是啊，它是电话费，对啊，它不是像我们台湾那1分钟1块钱可能还更贵花了整整1年的时间，然后那个电信公司跟他讲，因为你们家的区域太旧了，所以我们要整个区域要重新买线的话，就是要花费非常的多的钱，所以就是新旧区域也是有差别的，所以如果在国外做生意的话，这边功课全部都要做得很足不然到时候去那边，可能就是不是说只有想说，他们利润非常的高，非常高，但是实际的成本，其实没有你想象中的来的低就是很多一些小故事啊，那就是例如说，他还有跟我说什么，就是他们，因为他们本身，我那个朋友他们本身是在那个电脑公司上班的嘛，他有时候就会3不5时接到电话，就说，他们哪一个货柜，可能就整个货柜不见了，不知道到哪里去了，对啊，不过还好都是有保险的，所以在这部分的话，应该损失都会比较少一点点那就是基础设施啊，包括上下游厂商啊，这个也会关系到你这个成本的部分啊，是不是很齐全很完备啊？这个商业的这个基础的这个设施。那另外要考量的就例如说像自然资源啊，当地有什么矿产啊，然后土地取得会不会相对来的低啊，水利啊，自然环境啊之类的，都要去做这个很完善的这个评估那都市化的程度，市场它的特性啊，这个购买习惯的不同。例如说，亚洲的，在我的观察之下，亚洲的这个国家的这个人呢，他们可能是比较喜欢那种比较有品牌，名牌的这个商品，但是其实在其他国家并不一定是因为他们可能没有说常常有接受到这么样的资讯，所以如果今天你是要到其他国家去做生意，然后你经营的产品又是有品牌，但是其实不一定适用在其他的国家， 比如说，你今天有很多这种 LV 啊，Coach 啊，想要卖到其他的国家去，但是其他国家的人，他们可能这种购买习惯、消费习惯不一样，不一定，你卖到其他国家，一定会有人会想要去买，是不是？好，那国际汇率，为什么这也是很重要的？好，这里再分享我自己个人亲身的这个例子好了。我当初我是大概1990左右的时候去南非的嘛，哈。那时候呢，我去南非的时候，那时候的汇率是1:11，就是说11块台币换1块南非币。那班上同学有在买那个南非币的吗？知道现在多少吗？1:3点多。是啊，如果你当初拿了1100万去南非，不好意思，你现在只剩下300多万。所以呢，如果要投资的话，还要考量到这个国家是不是它的币值是不是很稳哦。好，那若干年前我有去，差不多那时间，大概10几年前吧，我去那个澳洲，然后那时候我去澳洲的时候，那时候是1:20块钱，就是说20块台币买它1块钱澳币，现在多少呢？30块左右吧，如果记得没错的话，应该差不多。就是你什么事情都不用做，2000万就变3000万了，是不是？那又回来了。如果当初选择去南非的这个企业呢，真的是被考过啦，真的，根本什么都不用做，你就赔本了。那如果English 选择去澳洲的话，有可能是赚钱，有可能。那加上如果说，你就投资它当地的这个土地啊什么的啊，这几年房地产飙涨，真的差非常的多。所以这个国际汇率，我们常常在听人家讲说什么保3保5的，为什么要这么累？这真的是没办法，他们就只能靠那些保3保5来赚钱了，尤其是那个科技业，不得不要这样子哦。所以国际汇率非常的重要。好，那外国投资也要去观察说，这个国外这个国家的投资环境好不好？好，那对这个外国厂商是不是很 friendly 啊？是不是他很愿意、很欢迎你来投资？会不会说从中作梗啊？你来投资完之后，一天到晚跟你说你又犯了什么法规什么的啊？那你可能真的是不知道怎么样继续走下去哈。好，所以你要去检视一下说，这个国家对外国厂商是不是很 friendly 哦？好。那会阻碍这个全球行销的这个障碍要去谈到说，例如说关税的部分啊，这个配额啊，贸易限制啊，还有这个货币障碍之类的，还有这个设定标准的部分。那这细节的部分我就不太不用详谈哈。好，那再来我们来看一下这个文化。为什么也要去仔细的去检视这个文化的部分？好，文化的基本面，物质文化、语言啊、教育啊，家庭啊，还有这个美感的部分，都要一一去做检视哦。你这个行销才有办法，真的是就是深入哦。科技水准，你看像我们台湾，现在很多同学他们就是有这个什么无线上网，是不是？就可以透过这样的这个科技呢，去做这个行销，才会3不5时就会接收到这个简讯啊，像我们现在用 LINE 啊，常常收到一些什么讯息啊，一些行销的这个讯息啊，那你就可以透过这样子的科技呢，去整理这个行销的部分。还有这个当地的这个经济水准的部分啊， 是不是？他是不是有能力？每个人都有能力去拥有一台这个智慧型手机啊？好，那语言的部分，每个地方的这个语言用语不太一样哦。那你要去做比较详细的这个功课哦，才有办法深入这个到一个国家。那例如说，这边可以稍微比较一下，台湾跟中国大陆用语有很多地方是不大一样的哦。例如说，我们台湾网际网络，中国大陆那边他把称之为这个互联网。好，那如果说你要讲网际网络的话，他们可能会觉得听不太懂哦，可能还要再思考一下。所以你在做行销的时候呢，就是要好好去做一下功课，然后去用他们的这个用语，去做这个行销。好，时间观念也有差别哦。看台湾人跟你说，我10分钟会打电话给你，就可能真的是10分钟哦，但是对意大利人可能是3天之内，非常有可能。真的，我有一次去那个意大利参加这研讨会的时候，我是还好，因为其实我比较了解这个外国人那种吃饭的那种时间，他们的时间是跟我们台湾人差非常的多的哦。那同行的这个同事，他们都觉得实在是没办法理解，因为我们从8点才吃第一道菜，8点哦，第2道菜是几点呢？9点半，还没有吃完呢，总共有3道菜，第3道菜嘞，我们等了大概11点半，很多同事他们都已经快要睡着了，真的是没办法接受啊，他们大概12点半才结束整个宴会，没办法接受啊。好，但是当地的人，他们把吃饭当作是一种交流的活动。一种 social 的活动，他们不是单纯只是吃饭而已哦，他们是去那边认识朋友、认识人的，他们不是说只是单纯的吃饭而已啊，所以不同的文化你就可能要去了解，这样才有办法说跟人家就是互动。那另外一个就是
不好意思，问个问题，因为其实很多国家吃饭，也都是一个交流的场合。是我很好奇，那一道菜的分量多少？可以吃多久？10分钟。
一道菜分量不多啊，但是你吃完之后你要喝酒啊，品尝一下那个白酒啊、红酒啊，对啊。对，开会前菜先有白酒，然后之后有红酒，所以你不是只有吃菜，还有喝酒、聊天，对，然后桌上每个人全部都认识完之后，还有隔壁很多桌，全部了解完之后，差不多12点半结束，可以回家了。对，常常都是这样的情况哦，不是说这不是特例，日常人都是这样子哦，是非常正常的哦。像我有一次也是一样去这个南欧希腊那边，也是参加研讨会。我还是没办法认同他们的那种时间观念哦。他们下午1点就开始休息一直到下午5点才开始又上班3个小时。然后1点之后呢，是路上完全没有人，我一个人走在那个雅典的市区，我想说为什么路上一个人都没有，是怎么一回事？好，我就看到很多的这个整间店都是男生，然后在那边聊天啊，然后在那边就是都是在聊天哦，但是路上都没有什么行人。我就觉得这样的国家为什么还可以支持下去哦？果不其然，几年后就发生了。对啊，所以对啊，你可以了解说，还是需要努力的。所以跟各国的这个人做生意你可能就要了解一下他们的美感，知道说他们的习惯到底是怎么样，互动的距离到底是怎么样， 你跟日本人做生意，跟美国人做生意，用的方法可能要不一样。跟日本人做生意的行销的方式，跟美国人行销的方式，可能也要差非常的多哦。好，那这边他把这个时间观单纯的把它归纳为2种就是单元时间观跟多元时间观。那单元时间观它指的是他在一段时间内他只专注一件事情。那他把每个时间都界定得非常的清楚。那多元时间观呢，就是说他在一个时间内还要安排很多事情，那是采取这个且战且走的方式。那大部分的文化，他们都是以多元跟这个单元时间观混合在一起的哦。那宗教部分，我这边在分享另外一个，也是我自己就是曾经发生的一些生活小趣事啦，就是也是我跟我一个这个印度的朋友一起出去吃饭，我不知道同学有没有跟印度人吃过饭，他们真的是用手，对啊，但是你要注意要用左手还是右手哦，那我忘记到底是用哪一手了，用左手的话是非常不礼貌的，对，是。他们这是用手吃饭，真的很厉害。在我这个外国人看到他们这样吃，我真的是没办法接受，我还是叫餐厅拿个刀叉给我，才有办法吃得下去了。对啊，那他另外一个就是，他们印度人也有分，或是他们那个阶级啊，分得非常清楚。他们有分白印跟这个就是这个伊斯兰教的这个印度人。那他们这2者之间是不大交流、不太同混的，阶级非常的清楚哦。那之前有一个认识的朋友跟我讲说，他是本身是白裔嘛，那他女生的话呢，他们是用这个姓氏去区分他们的这个阶级的所以他就是没办法嫁给比他姓氏阶级还要更低的人，他一定要往上爬。我觉得哇，天哪，那这样的话会不会有点困难？对啊，要结婚还要这么复杂，那也就是一些比较平常我们这个亚洲人比较不会拘泥在这种细节的部分，所以在价值跟态度部分，可能就是要完全的去了解哦。比如说，踏到人家的一些界限啊，反正是不好的。那例如说像每个文化对这个美感也有差别的哦。你看像这个日本人，他们结婚的时候要全身白色的，但是对我们来讲，全身白色觉得真的很奇怪，对不对？那他们结婚的时候呢，也是你要包那个白包给他们。那台湾如果收到白包的话，可能会非常生气。那这文化的差异是有的。入学率也非常重要。为什么很重要呢？因为如果你的消费者不了解你卖的葫芦里面卖什么药的话，那个代志就大条了。例如，我不知道各位有没有听过，就是有个厂商，他们要到这个非洲那边卖奶粉给当地的这个黑人。那有谁知道为什么黑人都不敢买吗？
这会变白啊。
不是，他不是 Michael Jackson 为什么呢？为什么黑人都不敢买这个厂商进来这个奶粉？奶粉就一般我们的这种奶粉啊，为什么他们不敢买呢？请大家想一下，什么原因呢？所以你在行销的话，行销人员就要知道它的美感咯。不然代志就真的抓掉了。奶粉啊，
是包装的问题吗？罐子
是。
那就像骨灰这样子。
还没有想到，到底是哪里出了问题呢？提示一下哦。那我直接讲公布答案好了。是罐子本身包装问题没有做，对，因为他们认为一般那个买奶粉外面是不是都有那婴儿照？对啊，很可爱的小婴儿照片。他认为里面卖的是那个婴儿。
哦，婴儿照在里面这样。
对啊。所以没有人敢买，对不对？是，说行销这么重要。对啊，好，那所以你要去了解说，哎，当地的教育啊，这很重要啊，对不对？他识字率不够啊，你必须要用他的方式去做行销啊，以他可以了解的方式去做行销。哦，所以从这个很简单例子可以了解，是不是真的要了解一下文化呢？哎，真的要哦。好，家庭部分我刚刚大概就有提到哦，就是家庭人口数嘛，可能会就是影响到说，哎，比如说一些包装的部分啊，或者说你形象的部分。好，这个的话我就不详述了。好，所以文化适应的步骤，哎，是非常重要的。好，那你必须要怎样？有足够的这个敏感性。好，不要说，哎，你认为这地方，他们的人是怎么想，你就认为说，哎，他们的需求你看得到，或是说，哎，你的需求就等于他们的需求，并不是哦。好，有很多地方他们习性不一样，文化不一样哦，都是需要去做一些就是了解之后，才有办法，就是真的是就是渗透到那个地区的哦。那再来，我再跟各位再分享另外一个影片。
Specific examples that I cover at the end about how Hardcall Silk tripled their sales by doing one thing, how an artist named Jeff Koons went from being nobody to making a whole bunch of money and having a lot of impact, to how Frank Gehry redefined what it meant to be an architect, and one of my biggest failures as a marketer in the last few years, a record label I started that had a CD called Sauce. But before I can do that, I got to tell you about sliced bread, a guy named Otto Rohrwetter. Now, before sliced bread was invented in the 1910s, I wonder what they said, like the greatest invention since the telegraph or something. But this guy named Otto Rohrwetter invented sliced bread, and he focused, like most inventors did, on the packing part and the making part. And the thing about the invention of sliced bread is this, that for the first 15 years after sliced bread was available, no one bought it, no one knew about it. It was a complete and total failure. And the reason is that until Wonder came along and figured out how to spread the idea of sliced bread, no one wanted it. That the success of sliced bread, like the success of almost everything we've been talking about at this conference, is not always about what the package is like or what the factory is like. It's about can you get your idea to spread or not. And I think that the way you're going to get what you want or cause the change that you want to change to happen is you're going to figure out a way to get your ideas to spread. And it doesn't matter to me whether you're running a coffee shop or you're an intellectual or you're in business or flying hot air balloons. I think that all this stuff applies to everybody regardless of what we do. That what we are living in is a century of idea diffusion. That people can spread ideas regardless of what those ideas are. When I talk about it, I usually pick business because they make the best pictures that you can put in your presentation and because it's the easiest sort of way to keep score. But I want you to forgive me when I use these examples because I'm talking about anything that you decide to spend your time to do. At the heart of spreading ideas is TV and stuff like TV. TV and mass media made it really easy to spread ideas in a certain way. I call it the TV industrial complex. The way the TV industrial complex works is you buy some ads, interrupt some people, that gets you distribution. You use the distribution you get to sell more products. You take the profit from that to buy more ads. And it goes around and around and around, the same way the military industrial complex worked a long time ago. Now that model of, and we heard it yesterday, if we can only get on the homepage of Google, if we can only figure out how to get promoted there, if we can only figure out how to grab that person by the throat and tell them about what we want to do, we can do that, then everyone would pay attention and we win. Well, this TV industrial complex informed my entire childhood and probably yours. And all of these products succeeded because someone figured out how to touch people in a way that they weren't expecting, in a way they didn't necessarily want, with an ad over and over and over again until they bought it. And the thing that's happened is they canceled the TV industrial complex. That just over the last few years, what anybody who markets anything has discovered is it's not working the way they used to. This picture is really fuzzy. I apologize, I had a bad cold when I took it. But the product in the blue box in the center is my poster child, right? I go to the deli, I'm sick, I need to buy some medicine. The brand manager for that blue product spent $100 million trying to interrupt me in 1 year. $100 million interrupt me with TV commercials and magazine ads and spam and coupons and shelving allowances and spit. I also have to ignore every single message. And I ignored every message because I don't have a human give a problem. I write the stuff in the yellow box I always have. I'm not going to invest a minute of my time to solve her problem because I don't care. Here's a magazine called Hydrate. It's 180 pages about water. Right? Articles about water, ads about water. Imagine what the world was like 40 years ago when it was a Saturday evening post in Time and Newsweek. Now there are magazines about water. New products from Coke Japan. Water salad. Coke Japan comes out with new products every 3 weeks because they have no idea what's going to work and what's not. This, I couldn't have written this better myself. It came out 4 days ago. I circled the important parts so you can see them here. They come out, Arby's is going to spend $85 million promoting an oven mitt with the voice of Tom Arnold, hoping that that will get people to go to Arby's and buy a roast beef sandwich. Now, I want you to try to imagine what could possibly be in an animated TV commercial featuring Tom Arnold that would get you to get in your car, drive across town, and buy a roast beef sandwich. Now, this is Copernicus, and he was right when he's talking to anyone who needs to hear the idea. The world revolves around me. Me, my favorite person, me. I don't want to get email from anybody. I want to get me now. So consumers, and I don't just mean people who buy stuff at the Safeway. I mean people at the Defense Department who might buy something, and people at, the New Yorker who might print your article. Consumers don't care about you at all. They just don't care. Part of the reason is they got way more choices than they used to, and way less time. And in a world where we have too many choices and too little time, the obvious thing to do is just ignore stuff. And my parable here is you're driving down the road and you see a cow and you keep driving. Because you've seen cows before. Cows are invisible. Cows are boring. Who's going to stop and pull over and say, oh, look, a cow? Nobody. But if the cow was purple, isn't that great? I can do that again. If the cow was purple, you'd notice it for a while. I mean, if all cows are purple, then you get bored with them. The thing that's going to decide what gets talked about, what gets done, what gets changed, what gets purchased, what gets built, is it remarkable? And remarkable is a really cool word, because we think it just means neat. But it also means worth making a remark about. And that is the essence of where idea diffusion is going. That 2 of the hottest cars in the United States is a $55,000 giant car, big enough to hold a Mini in its trunk. People are paying full price for both, and the only thing they have in common is they don't have anything in common. Every week, the #1 best-selling DVD in America changes. Never The Godfather, never Citizen Kane. It's always some third-rate movie with some second-rate star. But the reason it's number one is because that's the week it came out. Because it's new, because it's fresh, because people saw it, I didn't know that was there, and they noticed it. Two of the big success stories in the last 20 years in retail. One sells things that are super expensive in a blue box, and one sells things that are as cheap as they can make them. The only thing they have in common is that they're different. We're now in the fashion business. No matter what we do for a living, we're in the fashion business. And the thing is, people in the fashion business know what it's like to be in the fashion business. They're used to it. The rest of us have to figure out how to think that way. How to understand that it's not about interrupting people with big full-page ads or insisting on meetings with people. But it's a totally different sort of process that determines which ideas spread and which ones don't. This chair, they sold $1 billion worth of air on chairs by reinventing what it meant to sell a chair. They turned a chair from something the purchasing department bought to something that was a status symbol about where you sat at work. This guy, Lionel Fellini, the most famous baker in the world, he died 2.5 months ago, and he was a hero of mine and a dear friend. He lived in Paris. Last year he sold $10 million worth of French bread, every loaf baked in a bakery he owned by one baker at a time and wood fired up. And when Lionel started his bakery, the French poo-pooed it. They didn't want to buy his bread. It didn't look like French bread. It wasn't what they expected. It was neat. It was remarkable. And slowly, it spread from one person to another person until finally it became the official bread of 3-star restaurants in Paris. Now he's in London and he ships by FedEx all around the world. What marketers used to do is make average products for average people. That's what mass marketing is. Smooth out the edges. Go for the center. That's the big market. They would ignore the geeks and, God forbid, the laggards. It was all about going for the center. But in a world where the TV industrial complex is broken, I don't think that's the strategy we want to use anymore. I think the strategy we want to use is to not market to these people because they're really good at ignoring you. But market to these people because they care. These are the people who are obsessed with something. And when you talk to them, they'll listen because they like listening. It's about them. And if you're lucky, they'll tell their friends on the rest of the curve, and it'll spread. It'll spread through the entire curve. They have something I call otaku. It's a great Japanese word. It describes the desire of someone who's obsessed to say, drive across Tokyo to try a new ramen noodle place, because that's what they do. They get obsessed with it. To make a product, to market an idea, to come up with any problem you want to solve that doesn't have a constituency within a otaku is almost impossible. Instead, you have to find a group that really desperately cares about what it is you have to say. Talk to them and make it easy for them to tell your friends. There's a hot sauce otaku, but there's no mustard otaku. That's why there's lots and lots and lots of kinds of hot sauces and not so many kinds of mustard. Not because it's hard to make interesting mustard. You can make interesting mustard. But people don't because no one's obsessed with it and thus no one tells their friends. Krispy Kreme has figured this whole thing out. Krispy Kreme has a strategy. And what they do is they enter a city, they talk to the people who are talking, and then they spread through the city to the people who have just crossed the street. This yo-yo right here costs $112, but it sleeps for 12 minutes. Not everybody wants it, but they don't care. They want to talk to people who do, and maybe it'll spread. These guys make the loudest car stereo in the world. It's as loud as a 747 jet. You can't get in. The car's got bulletproof glass on the windows, so it'll blow out the windshield otherwise. But the fact remains that when someone wants to put a couple speakers in their car, if they've got their top or they've heard from someone who does, they go ahead and they pick this. It's really simple. You sell to people who are listening, and maybe, just maybe, those people tell their friends. So when Steve Jobs talks to 50,000 people at his keynote, who are all tuned in from 130 countries watching his 2-hour commercial, that's the only thing keeping his company in business. Is that those 50,000 people care desperately enough to watch a 2-hour commercial and then tell their friends. Pearl Jam, 96 albums released in the last 2 years. Everyone made a profit. How? They only sell them on their website. Those people who buy them on their website have the otaku, and then they tell their friends, and it spreads, and it spreads. This hospital could cost $10,000, 10 times the standard. But hospitals are buying it faster than any other model. Hard candy nail polish doesn't appeal to everybody, but to the people who love it, they talk about it like crazy. This paint can right here saved the Dutch Boy Paint Company, making them a fortune. Cost $35 regular paint because Dutch Boy made a can that people talk about because it's remarkable. They didn't just slap a new ad on the product, they changed what it meant to build a paint product. Now at HowDoNot.com, every day 250,000 people go to this site, run by 2 volunteers. And I can tell you they're hard graders. And they didn't get this way by advertising a lot. They got this way by being remarkable. Sometimes a little too remarkable. And this picture frame has a cord going out the back, and you plug it into the wall. My father has it on his desk, and he sees his grandchildren every day, changing, constantly. And every single person who walks into his office hears the whole story of how this thing ended up on his desk. And one person at a time, the idea spreads. These are not diamonds. Not really. They're made from cremains. After you get cremated, you can have yourself made into a gem. Oh, you like my ring? It's my grandmother. Fastest growing business in the whole mortuary industry. But you don't have to be Ozzy Osbourne. You don't have to be super outrageous to do this. What you have to do is figure out what people really want and give it to them. A couple quick rules to wrap up. The first one is design is free when you get to scale. And the people who come up with stuff that's remarkable more often than not figure out how to put design to work for them. Number 2, the riskiest thing you can do now is be safe. Procter & Gamble knows this. Right? The whole model of being Procter & Gamble was always about average products for average people. That's risky. The safe thing to do now is to be at the fringes, be remarkable. And being very good is one of the worst things you can possibly do. Very good is boring. Very good is average. It doesn't matter whether you're making a record album, or you're an architect, or you have a track on sociology. If it's very good, it's not going to work, because no one's going to notice it. So, my 3 stories. Silk. Put a product that does not need to be in the refrigerated section next to the milk in the refrigerated section. Sales tripled. Why? Milk, 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 not milk. For the people who were there and looking at that section, it was remarkable. They didn't triple their sales with advertising. They tripled it by doing something remarkable. That is a remarkable piece of art. You don't have to like it, but a 40-foot tall dog made out of bushes in the middle of New York City is remarkable. Frank Gehry didn't just change the museum, he changed an entire city's economy by designing one building that people from all over the world went to see. Now, at countless meetings, at the Portland City Council or who knows where, they said, we need an architect. Can we get Frank Gehry? Because he did something that was at the fringes. And my big failure, I came out with a record album, and hopefully a whole bunch of record albums in SACD format. It's a remarkable new format, and I marketed it straight to people with $20,000 stereos. People with $20,000 stereos don't like new music. So, what you need to do is figure out who does care. Who is going to raise their hand and say, I want to hear what you're doing next, and sell something to them. The last example I want to give you, this is a map of Soap Lake, Washington. As you can see, if that's nowhere, it's in the middle of it. But they do have a lake. And people used to come from miles around to swim in the lake. They don't anymore. So the founding fathers at some lake said, we got some money to spend. What can we build here? And like most communities, they were going to build something pretty safe. And then an artist came to them. This is a true artist rendering. He wants to build a 55-foot tall lava lamp in the center of town. That's a purple cow. That's something worth noticing. I don't know about you, but if they build it, that's what I'm going to do. Thank you very much for your attention.
好，你们看完这个影片之后，对行销是不是有更深一层的了解？有吗？有吸收一点点进去吗？一点点。好，它里面有提到什么？要创造什么卓越非凡的产品，给对的人哦，不是所有的人哦。要找对的人，对的人是谁？ 目标客户嘛，不是一大群人哦，不是 A B C D 全部都找哦，对的人他就会帮你怎样，把产品跟他的朋友分享。手机很炫啊，我一定要买一台，对不对？智慧型手机，这个刚出来的，跟朋友分享，朋友觉得这台手机怎么那么棒，我要的功能全部都有了，我也要去买一台，这才是对的人啊，找对的人帮你做宣传，会比你去花很多很多的钱找到错人做宣传还要有一个成效哦。所以总结来说，行销要做什么？你不是只有创造需求而已哦，不是只有创造需求这么简单，也不是只有创造价值这么简单而已哦。那还有什么？还有什么呢？那让他感觉什么？刚刚第一个影片提到的，创造出一个可以让人感受到幸福的环境，可以感受到幸福的商品，是不是？还有创造出一个卓越非凡的东西，让他觉得跟人家与众不同，那这样才是真正的成功，是不是？好，感谢大家。
我们谢谢尤老师很精彩的分享哦。他其实我觉得，大家眼睛做一下哈。我这边有做一些补充的哈，补充是因为我知道我们学生的背景是不是管理学背景的，所以他可能有一些不太懂的地方，我等一下再补充。但是我觉得尤老师部分的话，是今天从一个概括性的，从行销的演进，然后到环境，然后到文化部分做一个简单的一个概述。但是其实我对我自己而言，我觉得自己收获蛮多的哈。其中是这两个影片。我不知道你有没有感觉，他第一个影片讲到什么东西呢？讲到那个幸福感，对不对？他其实在比较什么东西？他一直在强调所谓的 GDP。好，其实如果你有注意到一些坊间，或是我们每次到了年底啊，或是年初的时候，就各国就开始比较 GDP， 就是各国的那个经济成长率。那经济成长率的部分的话，它的计算方式就是 C 加 I 加 G 加 S 减 M， 哈，就是你的消费，就是我们后来卖出去最终消费价值。好，去算消费加投资加政府的支出，好，然后加上你的出口减掉进口，最后那个价值都代表一个国家整年度最终的一个产品，这个国民生产力的部分。所以各国会去比较 GDP 的地方在于说呢 ，GDP 可以显现出一个国家在当年度里面所有各个单位的努力的结果跟成品。所以各国才会追求所谓的 GDP 的成长率，就是我今年要比去年更好。有没有？所以才会出现了保三保五啊！哈，我们叫今年就讲了喊出来保三保五，然后像大陆他们就喊出来 GDP 是要保7嘛。那就是因为它要支撑这么大的经济价值的部分。可是，在第一个影片里面就发现说呢，早期经济学者他们看中的什么东西是什么东西？有形资产。可是你会发现，现在有很多因为环境来改变的时候呢，你发现有形资产其实，比如说好了，我们讲的是很多黑心商品，它创造了 C 没有错，对不对？它有很多的经济价值在消费的部分。可是问题是，它损害了什么东西啊？国民健康。那这个部分的话，它的 GDP 再怎么高，是不是对这个国家不见得是一件有利的事情？可是早期经济学者看的部分只看到有形这一块。好，就好像说，比如说我们早期在诟病所谓的大陆市场的部分 GDP 很高，可是它其实有一些不好的一些负面的影响，比如说像大陆的话，因为经济成长部分造成很大的一个 GDP 成长，可是相对的对环境污染。碳的排放是一个很大的问题嘛，所以有很多国家在诟病它。所以我觉得第一个影片里面提出来一个幸福感的部分哈，就是说我们不要去看 GDP， 而是算所谓的幸福的指数哈，幸福毛额的部分。我觉得我很喜欢这个概念。为什么这么讲？其实像台湾，尤其像我们成教的部分，我们面临到是高龄化社会。那高龄化社会部分的话，其实你会发现说，有时候人到了一个退休年龄，55岁、65岁退休之后的话，其实我们需要的是什么东西啊？我们自己一个所谓的幸福感的归属感，哈，不然就觉得我好像对这个社会是没有价值的。那影片当中里面他就问到说，那可是他很好奇是说，幸福感它是一个抽象的，它是一个无形的东西，我怎么去一个量化东西去做个衡量的部分？他讲到一个很大重点，刚才尤老师一直讲到。所以幸福感部分，它不是在创造幸福，因为幸福很难被创造，它创造的是一个环境，这个环境可以帮大家带来幸福的概念。哦，我好喜欢这样的一个结论哦，因为我觉得说，就我们成教的概念而言的话呢，其实不管在成人教育或在高龄教育的部分这一块，其实我们很难去帮长者创造幸福，我也很难去帮成年人创造幸福，尤其在说终身学习这一块。可是也许我可以创造的是一个环境，让你觉得学习可以帮你带来是幸福的感觉。 好，这是一个我觉得今天一个很好的分享，我非常喜欢的这一块。那第二个部分的话是觉得说，在那个最后一个影片，这个影片的部分其实你发现讲那么多，它其实一直出现一只牛，然后身上是紫色。我在猜它是不是在搭配那个有一本书叫《紫牛》？对，我也在讲，就红海，就是那个红海不是一本是那个什么蓝海策略，蓝海策略完之后隔了半年还是1年之后就出现了一本紫牛。那其实这2件事情都要讲一件事情啦，都要讲行销的差异化策略。好，那其实我也喜欢它里面讲到一个这个东西，它讲到什么东西啊？我们早期的话呢会针对大众。好去做所谓的大众行销，就是我希望我这个产品卖出来是卖给所有人的，我可以赚到最多钱。因为我们集中化行销部分的话，我们风险会很大。可是因为现在供给太多了，竞争者太多了，所以如果我在锁定这个最大众的这个部分的话，其实我是没有差异性的。所以呢，我们应该是什么东西呢？是锁定那个早期被我们放弃的 B 跟 C， 就是那个离异值的部分，最独特。他说早期我们觉得他很怪，他很奇怪，所以我们更不想做他的生意。可是如果说现在我们可以重视到他们的需求的时候，其实我们可以他们可以为我们带来其他另外的效益的部分哈。然后其中他还讲了一句话，我觉得很好，他说现在最危险的事就是在做最安全的事。对行销，对我觉得这个领域的话，任何人都适用。我只是这么讲，比如说好，我们回归到我们在座有很多是这种社区大学的，或是在非营利单位的部分。那比如说我们非营利单位的部分，我们想要获取最大宗的一个所谓的赞助或者是资金的部分，所以我们一定走安全牌嘛，对不对？我们是想要集中最大数人能够捐献给我们，或者是我们今天开的课程，我们是活大众的需求就是开的课程。可是呢，你相对你投注在这个 A 这个市场的时候，你的竞争者是多的，你是没有差异性的。那如果我调整一下，我不要去跟大家抢啊，我不要去抢红海市场啊，我们来找向蓝海，看看有没有其他的东西 B 或 C， 比如说就以社大好了。早期我们讲说，我们社大研究里面的话，女生是最多的学员人数，所以呢，我们就知道说，大家的这个面貌、这个想法，所以我们开的课程就是什么打安全牌。女生喜欢干嘛？唱歌、跳舞、烘焙、做花、好聊天这些东西。所以我知道我一开课，那个学员数一定会来，所以我就开这些课程。可是问题是，房间里面有这么多的课程都跟我是一样的，所以也是一样的。你确定说女性的那个学员人数是最多的，那可是相对而言的话，她的选择也多。那如果我换个角度想呢，我来走什么东西？男性市场嘞？对不对？其实有时候不是男生不爱念、不爱来上课、不爱继续进修，是因为你们开的课程都不是活男生的啦，有没有？男生喜欢弄什么象棋呀、或摄影啊，有没有？或是有一些其他的一些同好之类的一些聊天啊，或是旅游。可是我们相对我们的一些课程，这些都没有，因为大家都说什么安全牌。所以这个相对而言的话是比较少的，那也是一样，也是这里思考到什么？我们暨大成教所的定位，我们到底想要什么锁定大众，跟大家走中正学习或成人教育，或者是所有长者的部分。可是这样好像跟中正又没有什么区隔，对不对啊？所以也许我们可以再找到另外一个定位的部分。所以我觉得刚刚老师的分享就让我想到这些，这很好的一个连结。然后这是什么东西呢？比如说他刚刚讲到文化部分叫语言。所以也是啊，有时候那个时间观念，我们跟那些长者，他的时间跟我们的时间是不一样的。长者9点对他而言就像半夜了，然后5点就叫天亮了。可是我们的时间刚好颠倒，然后9点这是我们的黄金时间，晚上9点是我们的黄金时间，对不对？然后呢早上5点才是我们睡觉的时间。好，是这部分的话，也许我们在跟长者沟通的时候，我们的语言啊，我们的时间的概念啊，那个单位是不太一样的。这也就是我们在做一些所谓行销，或是在一些我们应用在我们的成人教育或中人力资源发展部分里面，我觉得大家可以去思考的一个面向。这大概是我自己一些心得啦。所以我们还有现在10分钟时间，有没有同学有其他的分享或是要提问的？针对刚刚的议题。
没有。
老师，那个讲到行销，当然这是一个比较说深入也是蛮深入的。那早期我们都行销，第一个就把它讲到通路，有通路可能就有行销，这是一个技巧。但是现在的新的一个说法，像是通路又落伍了。他现在在讲究说，我卖东西给你，最好直接就跳过那些中间通，直接卖到就是消费者身上。第一个可能这个中间那个利润就减少了，所以在消费者的收到的时候，可能它价格也比较低。所以现在都好像讲究直接的行销，因为透过网络这个区块。 那像这样的说法是不是真的是可以接受的？就直接就说，我只要透过网络，不用透过中间者，不用透过那个中介，就可以少掉很多的费用。那直接把这个费用就直接转嫁给消费者，可能是2000块的东西，可能我直接卖给你就只要1400块。那这样对消费者是不是真的是比较有保障？那对于这个生产者或是销售人是不是要便利很多？那像这种理论是不是很现在有很多这样的说法，是不是可行性？
你说，例如说像直销行销的部分吗？
对，也可以这样，
你可以这样说，但是可能也要去考量到说，消费者他们的接受度啊，因为不是所有的人都可以接受像透过这个网络来做购物，然后完全没有看到商品，直接就购买商品的。所以有一些族群他们必须要看到实体，他才愿意去做购买。所以我觉得，当然他以后这个直销行销的占比有可能会提高，如果说因为它的这个价格降低的关系啦，但是我觉得通路还是非常的重要，你还是要把持到这个通路才有办法，就是成功获利，对啊，不一定说一定要透过这个，全部都是透过这个网络。好，还有其他问题？
欲言又止。
这个闪哥的问题，就是刚才那个，就是最大块那个是 A 吗？如果万一你开的课，你是要吸收 B 跟 C， 万一 B 跟 C 的人很少达不到那个，因为应该开课是有标准的吧？
我知道 ，OK。好，这个应该就是
讲到那个什么产品那个市场的足量性，我们讲到行销，我讲到会做市场区隔。就会把它分成区块，比如说我现在分成3块，对不对？那你刚刚讲到是针对说，这个地方就是人太少了，所以当然也是一样。比如说我们之前讲过说，这个市场够不够大？大到说我特地为了他们再开一个市场，比如说我问你，100岁人瑞是不是一个市场？是。但你有需要为了他们，因为可能全台湾才10个100岁以上的人，那我们就会考虑到这个足量性就不够，所以你就不用为了他们额外再设一个产品给他们。当然，你还是要考量到那个市场够不够大，大到说可以 cover 掉你的成本的部分，对。
有要补充的吗？
好，那我们很感谢尤老师他今天一个很精彩的分享，至少我觉得他把我们一些跟行销的一个基本的概念从一开始早期的那个行销的演进的部分，他刚刚讲到一个很好玩的，他说行销在交换，他不是举个例子嘛，就看电影的时候不是要交换娱乐嘛，我当时讲那个例子，我心里就闪过一个念头，不是念头，就是一个真实案件发生在我身上。就是我觉得有时候看电影那天有一次我跟我先生去看电影，然后到了现场，那你知道台北电影院人都很多，然后那时候他就跟我们讲说，中间位置已经就是位置都没有了，可是有那一种中间地方，但是是分2个位置，就是同一排，但不会连坐在一起，就问我们愿不愿意买那个票，对，就是2个被拆开。那我先生说 OK 没问题，我就说你就真的买了，他说对啊，反正进去也是你看你的，我看我的啊，所以我们干嘛一定要坐在一起？年轻人约会的时候不是硬要坐在一起啊，手牵手，对不对？结果结了婚之后就跟我讲说，没问题，进去也是各看各的，你不会打扰我，我不会打扰你们，门口相见就好了。他就把那个票买回来了，他真的在换娱乐，他不是在换那个什么，那个不是情人对，他不是在讲那个什么约会，他不是在换约会，他是真的买电影票换娱乐，不是在换约会。然后讲这个例子的时候，我就觉得好，讲的真的很贴切。好，那我们再掌声谢谢一下我们的老师。
他下午还有课，对不对？好啦，休息一下。